Winter Latina show.
Hosted by IDM.
And here we are recording. You're going to be watching us from the future or from the past. I never remember what the deal is.
We are in the
Hello,
past,
Nina.
they are in the future. Welcome to another fun-filled episode of the Winter Latina show, which is being recorded so that you are currently watching us recording it in the past and you are the people of the future. But hopefully it won't take too long to release this one. And in this episode, I will tell you another story. And Marcelo doesn't know the story, so I'm kind of curious as to what his thoughts and opinions are, and of course, your opinions as well. So this man is sitting in prison. He was just sentenced to life in prison, and he's only 25 years old. He's going to spend the rest of his natural life in prison for murder, for an assassination, really. On the one hand, it's obviously highly distressing, disappointing to know that you're going to live the rest of your life in prison, because this is not what any 25-year-old with his entire life ahead of him should be thinking about. And this particular man doesn't know it yet, but he is exactly halfway through his life. He's 25 and he's got another 25 years to go. On the other hand, the reason, the cause for being sentenced to life in prison, and in fact his sentence was commuted from a death sentence in a kind of a liberalizing move, in his view, might have been worth it. Now, he wasn't the one to actually kill the man in question. He never really wanted to mar his hands. He always had his underlings do it, at least when it came to people. And there were many, many people who died because of this man. The target that was now dead might have been worth it. He wasn't just a normal man, a regular man, a man on the street. He was a freaking minister, a minister of the interior. Now that, to him, was a pretty damn successful assassination. The former minister, the minister of the interior, was just going to have lunch. He was walking into a little cafe, he was going to sit down for lunch, and bam, now he's dead. And this 25-year-old is in prison for life, because he was part of the conspiracy. Really, he was the conspiracy. He wasn't the one to actually kill him, but he was the one to initiate him. And he'll have a lot more blood on his hands. He already did, but he wasn't sentenced for those previous ones. And in his view, the Minister of the Interior was an enemy. And that's the only way you could really handle enemies. You had to take them out. And he's been training for this moment his entire life, since he was a little boy. He was the shortest little boy, the scrawniest little boy. Some would say the ugliest little boy in his village. He had quite an overbite. And he had to work really hard as the shortest, scrawniest, and ugliest little boy in his village to assert some kind of dominance. And the best way he thought this could happen was by killing cats. 1 cat, 2 cats, 10 cats, who's counting? They're in a village. No one really knows whom they belong to. They're just kind of running around. They're in the farm fields. Maybe they're going after mice, helping the farmers. Who's going to miss a cat? He really, really, really enjoyed strangling them, because that was his method of killing cats, and watching their life drain from their beautiful eyes, watching their small, soft, furry bodies go limp as he strangled them. And he didn't strangle them somewhere in the privacy of his home, somewhere in a little grove outside the farm field in his little village. He strangled them right in front of the other children. So even though he was the scrawniest, littlest, and some would say the ugliest little boy in the village, he was very, very successful in gaining respect, in gaining dominance and instilling fear in his peers by strangling countless cats, something that he really enjoyed and something that we can find in the biographies of this man today. Now, if we were watching a true crime episode today, we would probably see a comfy office with a nice leather armchair, a psychologist, psychiatrist, psychotherapist sitting in this chair and qualifying such actions by a young kid who was really, really into killing cats. This psychological specialist would probably tell us that this is one of the telltale signs of psychopathy or the related antisocial personality disorder as seen in kids, animal abuse, but not just any kind of animal abuse, extreme animal abuse, such as torture and the killing of animals. But this was not the 21st century. This was a little village in Galicia in the early 20th century, and this boy's parents did not have such a psychotherapist, psychologist, psychiatrist tell them that this particular pastime of their child was actually dangerous, and it was not a good sign of things to come. And so this little boy continued practicing instilling fear in his peers and gaining respect by strangling cats, something that he now couldn't do because he was in prison for life. Marcelo, what strikes you about this?
I have still no idea about whom you're talking about, but it sounds a lot like Mr. Ballin's video that I watch every now and then. But yeah, since you say you talk about Galicia, I would imagine there is something related to Ukraine and to some Ukrainian movements.
What do you think about the repeated animal torture at a young age?
Well, I've watched a lot of documentaries about psychopathies and people that are in prison, in jail for life in the United States in the 20th centuries, and there's always some relations to a hard childhood with killing animals or torturing animals or things like that. That's a subject of that should be more talked about, I would say. But I still have no idea where we're going today.
Sure, and this is why I brought it up, because it's something that is quite common to be mentioned on true crime documentaries. But like I said, this boy's parents in the early 20th century probably didn't have a psychologist available to them in their little village in the farm field to tell them that this is probably not a very good sign about their son's actions. And this little boy grew up and he was going to lead a pretty normal life. He had a farming family. He helped out around the house. He actually never ended up working in his entire life. He's never had any kind of a job, but he was pretty successful at what his chosen field of his chosen expertise turned out to be. But at this time, as he grew up, he was in his teens. He was going to what was called a polytechnic university, and he was studying agriculture because he lived in a farming community, so he was going to specialize in this. But much like college kids these days would rather be partying or staying a little bit longer on spring break and going a little bit wild, he also had very little interest in his college studies. It was much more fun for this now young man. He was only 5'2", so he kind of stayed fairly short. He still had his overbite.
Can we translate these to meters?
I would say it was about maybe 150.
Okay.
58 centimeters. Sort of,
okay.
Yeah. About 1.5 meters. Yeah, for those of you who do not use the imperial system, which is kind of funny because I know the entire planet. all but three countries. No, I think I told you one of the most liberating things to do was to set my weather to Celsius instead of using Fahrenheit, which I still do. So I did this a couple years ago, and I feel very good about that. So yeah, but yeah, he was about 1.5 meters. So he didn't really grow up. He was a little boy, and he grew up to be a shorter man. He still had this overbite. He started balding pretty early. So he wasn't the most aesthetically pleasing leader, even though he became quite the leader. So as he was extremely bored by studying agriculture, instead of partying like today's college kids do, he had another activity that he found really fun, and that was terrorism. So he and his underlings would engage in something like blowing up a post office or killing teachers. I mean, these weren't the teachers that were necessarily teaching his classes, but this was the teachers that were really working to improve the relations between the local Ukrainian and Polish population. They would be Polish teachers teaching the Ukrainian language to Ukrainians, or it would be Ukrainians that would be getting along with the Poles, and he couldn't have that. There's no way that in his mind, Ukrainians and Poles should be getting along. Therefore, these people were his enemies, and they were to be taken out. Much like a few years later, he was in charge of the conspiracy to take out the Polish Interior Minister, Piracki, because this minister was working to create reasonable relations with equal rights for both the Polish and the Ukrainian population in Galicia. Therefore, he was an enemy, and he was to be taken out. This young man was dreaming of a glorious, glorious Ukraine. Of course, he's never ever set foot in Ukraine, not in his entire life, but he always dreamt of it from afar. Galicia was, of course, not part of Ukraine. Ukraine was somewhere far away in the Soviet Union. But he always idealized Ukraine, and he could not stomach the idea that Poles and Ukrainians in his area that was at the time controlled by Poland, and previously it was controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he could not stomach the idea that they would get along. And much like he practiced on killing cats when he was little, he started engaging in more serious acts of terrorism, like going after teachers, or at that stage in his life, culminating in the assassination of this Minister of the Interior, who, by the way, was not an old man. He was only 39 years old. He was very promising. And like I said, he was trying to improve the sometimes difficult inter-ethnic relations in that particular region. But that wasn't the only enemies that this young man was going to take out. Obviously, at that stage, at 25 years old, he kind of assumed that he was just going to spend his entire life in prison. But just a few years later, 5 years later, a savior came to the region. He was Austrian, he had a little mustache, and people called him the Führer. You can probably guess who that savior is.
I believe this guy's a painter, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah,
right?
I think that was his earliest profession. He was a painter. So the Führer's
something like that.
This was 1939. The Führer's troops overran this area as they took over Poland and Galicia, that was controlled by Poland. And this young man, who was now heading towards the age of 30, was freed. And he was viewed to be as being very, very useful to his savior, the Austrian with a little mustache. The young man, whose name was Stepan Bandera, was a leader. He became the leader of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists that had connections to other organizations, such as the Ukrainian Insurgent Army during World War II. And Nazi Germany, at least initially, considered him to be very useful. Now, in their view, they wanted to use these Ukrainians in their troops as one of the sort of creating battalions specifically to operate in the parts of then Soviet Union that were They're under Nazi control, but some of them, of course, as they were heading eastward, were controlled by the Red Army, and this is where the battles were taking place during the course of World War II. But from the standpoint of Stepan Bandera and his underlings, he wanted to use the Germans in turn for his own purposes. For instance, to have sort of a final showdown with the local Polish population. And in some ways they did by engaging in all kinds of atrocities and massacres with a civilian death toll, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And these were not just ethnic Poles, there are families that were mixed, Polish-Ukrainian families, or Ukrainians that were deemed to be friendly toward the Poles. So in Bandera's eyes and the eyes of his underlings, these people were enemies, and much like the cats from his childhood, much like the teachers of his youth, much like the Interior Minister of Poland, they were all enemies, and the only way to deal with enemies, in his view, was to take them out. And he's been training for this his entire life. So the Germans pretty quickly realized that their local underlings with the Ukrainian insurgent army, the battalions like Nachtingall, and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, B, that was run by Bandera, they were much more brutal than Nazi Germany was itself, which is kind of shocking to think about. And in fact, one of these battalions was quickly reorganized and actually sent into Nazi-controlled Belarus because of how brutal they were. And they were really kind of not doing what Nazi Germany wanted them to do. So they're sort of using each other in this particular context. And pretty quickly, both the German Abwehr and sort of the inner higher-ranking party circles of Nazi Germany considered this young man, Bandera, a thug. They perceived him as a thug. They were still funding these organizations, much like NGOs are funded today, and much like, so Bandera, in a sense, was sort of a foreign agent, and much like NGOs are funded today, sometimes people overstep boundaries and they steal money, and that's exactly what Bandera was doing. He was basically engaging in theft. He was stealing Nazi German money for his own purposes. And this money ended up in a Swiss bank. So once Nazi German officialdom realized how much money their little friend had stolen from them, they actually arrested him, and his charges was essentially something that could be comparable to theft or money laundering, like really a white-collar crime, in addition to all the thuggish behavior with not only the extermination of the local Polish and Ukrainian Pole-friendly population, civilians, but also instigating massacres within the ranks of his own organization as a way of fighting for power and staying in power. So they put Bandera in a concentration camp, but he wasn't in a concentration camp where, much like other people in Nazi Germany and German-occupied areas, lived and died. He was in a special area that was reserved for officers that were sort of in reserve, that were recovering. So he lived in a kind of almost like a hotel that has been described as a hotel. So he was really receiving very much special treatment. He was definitely not suffering, even though he was initially under house arrest in Krakow, and then he was in this concentration camp for a little while. So even though he was considered a thug by Nazi German officialdom, and even though he was arrested for stealing large sums of money and putting them in a Swiss bank, which again sounds really mind-blowing and hilarious to me, he was really treated very well. So that just makes you think that he was useful, regardless of overstepping the bounds and really trying to pursue his own goals. What do you think, Marcelo?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, well, first of all, when you start talking about Galicia, the first thing that came to my mind was the Flagman. So I was already kind of waiting for it, but not sure at some point. And, Flagman, because Bandeira in Portuguese.
Sure.
And
Spanish, I believe, as well, right? Isn't it?
Spanish, yes, like Antonio.
Yeah.
And But yeah, as I was mentioning before, I think it's interesting for people to understand that um, in psychology, when you go to therapy or things like that, what the profession is doing is trying to unlock things that in your mind are locking. I mean, your behavior is locked by some things on your mind that you yourself does not go forward. You just keep yourself from going forward because you have, as I mentioned here a lot of times in the channel. So the idea of the channel, for example, had was 1 year prior to it launching, because
Hmm.
for 1 year I was I will use the word afraid to go on camera, to go live, to be seen outside and things like
Hmm.
that. Was not prepared to doing that. And at the same point, on the other hand, once you unlock some things, you kind of cross the barrier. You cross the line. So there's no coming back. One thing that's interesting in watching these documentaries about criminals and stuff like that is that you understand that there is some types of crimes that is just not it's impossible to come back to bring these people to a normal person's life. uh, I would say almost, because we never know, but it's a line crossed. So once someone kills someone else, it that line is crossed, that ship sailed. Okay, so the person may live the entire life without doing it again, but it may come, once it's done, well, I already did it, why not again? Stuff like that. And as you tell the story of the guy, so he not only crossed this line, very young, with animals, and who knows what,
Exactly.
small
We don't
small
know if there
city.
were other things that were not documented because this is a village in Galicia,
Yeah,
farming farmlands
kids
in the
drawn.
early 20th century. So we don't really know if there were any children, like his peers, that may have
Exactly.
disappeared as well, and there was practice on them too. But I think it's
Exactly.
interesting, like when you say crossing the line, I think that also depends on what it is, because you could say that obviously murder is not just morally wrong, but it's illegal. But you can also say we understand when, let's say, there is like a drunken bar fight and someone goes too far. It's wrong, it's bad, it's criminal, it should be punished. But
that
we can kind of
that's
understand.
unwilling.
Right.
That's
We can kind of
unwilling. That's
understand how something like
happens.
that happens. When you think about the premeditated enjoyment of killing
Hmm.
helpless, beautiful little kittens, it's almost like a meme. Like it's kind of hard to imagine that a child would be doing this repeatedly, and that this is something that would make it into biographies about this man. So it's documented in some shape or form. And now, of course, some of his biographers would try to explain it away by exactly as I was presenting it, that enemies need to be dealt with, and this was his practice. But a psychologist would, or a psychiatrist, right, would use a very different type of metric to describe something
Hmm.
like this. And then I think we're sort of deep into the question of nurture nature, because in some of these crime shows, they talk about a difficult upbringing. They may talk about some kind of childhood abuse that these children may have suffered, but in other cases, these families seem to be fairly regular. Nothing really awful happens in them, and nonetheless, these children do something like that. And so then the question is there something more about the nature of this person? And of course, we can really never know, I think, at this stage. It might be something that is triggering in the environment to someone in one environment that would not be triggering in another environment. But there's definitely that underlying question, right? So I think it's pretty fascinating to see a man who is considered these days to be a hero of Ukraine, and this was way before even the 2013, 2014 regime change. He was sort of canonized in the Ukrainian national canon of heroes, that this would be the kind of person that would be chosen. And I think it also goes to a deeper question about, what about all the other ruthless leaders in history? So many leaders would execute, people that were dissidents or would go after their opponents. And I think that is true to a certain extent, but the difference here is the idea of state building. You can take a ruthless leader, but you can also say, from history, you can also say that particular leader also engaged in state building and was a successful statesman. Here, there is no sign of any success. There's just a sign of violence. It literally is about just a very pure animalistic fight for power. I don't even think animals do this. I mean, I guess they probably do within some of their social structures, but in terms of going out and carrying out massacres in his own organization to sort of stay at the top. And of course, going after civilians that were perceived as enemies. And of course, that definition is, as broad as can be. And when you have Nazi German officialdom considering you a thug and considering you brutal and your organization brutal, that says a lot, right? So, I mean, I don't think anything else needs to be said beyond that. So I think the psychology here is definitely one of the fact that it's documented. There's probably all kinds of psychological things that we can say about other people of similar nature and maybe actual political leaders that did rise to power. But here, the fact that psychological feature was documented pretty well in this man's official biographies, I think is pretty fascinating. And so going back to the story, the mustachioed Austrian painter rescued him not once but twice. So first he was rescued from a Polish prison in 1939, and the second time he was rescued in 1944 as the Soviet Red Army was inexorably heading east toward Berlin, and it was sort of making its way through Poland, liberating Poland from the Nazi German presence. And at that time, Bandera was rescued by none other than Otto Skorzeny. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he was a famous Nazi German intelligence operative, very, very highly positioned, and he was famous, I think, in sort of popular culture for rescuing Benito Mussolini from essentially in a raid from arrest. So that's sort of the most famous thing about him. But he also rescued Bandera from the Red Army that was coming into that area, and Bandera probably wouldn't have had a very good time had they made their way to where he was housed. So that again says the fact that the mustachioed Austrian painter rescued him not once but twice in 39 and in 44, despite him being considered a thug, despite him stealing all this money, he clearly was very important. And this is how eventually he ended up living in Germany, right? He ended up living in Munich with his family, and by then, in the aftermath of World War II, he became important to the Anglo-American intelligence agencies precisely because of his wartime connections and his perception and his status as the leader of this organization or being linked to other organizations as well. And that's, in that context, he would have been very useful as someone who was an anti-Soviet figure. And obviously, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So he lived in Munich with his family for many years. At that stage, for people who did not know that he had this trail of blood and mass murder, starting from Katz and ending with not just the Minister of the Interior, but also all of the civilians that were massacred in Berlin and in other places, and the teachers that were killed when he was just going to college, to university. If they were to just see him, they would probably think of him as this sort of dignified Asian bureaucrat. So, he was still 5'2", about 1.5 meters, right? He had a little bit of a pot belly. He was balding. He had his overbite. He had his children. He would go vacation and go skiing in the Alps, like a very, very typical lifestyle of someone living in Europe, in Germany in the 1950s. So from the outside, he looked like a completely, almost a boring bureaucrat who was just, leading a normal life. And still, He never worked. Remember, he never worked a day in his life other than helping out his family, on the farm as a child. So that's also very interesting. Where is the money coming from for that particular dignified aging bureaucrat lifestyle? And in a twist of fate, much like the Minister of Interior that was assassinated in 1934 as he was sitting down to eat, one day, Bandera was coming home with a nice little grocery bag of tomatoes and some other vegetables. He was going to make a salad. He was going up the stairs in his building, and his death was descending down those stairs in 1959. So in kind of a cyclical manner where history repeated itself, and maybe a little bit of a poetic justice, he too was assassinated without being able to eat his delicious salad, much like Minister Piratsky was unable to eat his lunch due to being killed. And he was assassinated by Stashinsky, who was a KGB agent, and some would claim that he was a little bit of an unwilling KGB agent. He was kind of forced into that particular position. But nonetheless, he successfully assassinated Bandera in Munich exactly 25 years after he was imprisoned for killing the Minister of the Interior of Poland at the time. And there's the question of whether it's worth assassinating someone who was a brutal leader, some would say a mass murderer, and then making him into a bit of a martyr for at least his followers, whether it was worth doing that. But that's what happened. And I think that's a question, that's a question for you. I don't know if I can really answer this question. This is something that happened under Khrushchev, obviously, between the end of World War II in 1945 and 1959. I mean, this took a long time to hunt them down. And as we know, Khrushchev ended up also a little bit later releasing tens of thousands of Banderites that were imprisoned because of, there was a difficult sort of, maybe not difficult, complex political international context of improving relations with European countries that were on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and releasing these Banderites was sort of one of these gestures of goodwill. But of course, they were never rehabilitated ideologically. Remember, we talked about this before. They were just kind of released. They lived their lives. Some of them ended up climbing the political ladder within the Communist Party as sort of an instrument. And after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they went back to openly engaging in the ideology they held, or their family members earlier held during World War II, and sort of in hiding during that Soviet period. So that's another question. So obviously that Khrushchev period is very complicated. On the one hand, he had Bandera, assassinated. On the other hand, he released all these people in a very naive way, I would say, maybe even a stupid way. But I don't know. I guess that's a question for the audience and for you, whether going after someone like this is really worth it.
Let's start front back. About Khrushchev, sometimes we put a lot of thinking on the symbol, and the symbol is the person on the top. So Khrushchev was the president at the moment, but perhaps this is unrelated.
General, no presidents then. General Secretary.
General Secretary. I'm sorry. So this is so in general we point to one top image, I would say, like that, or leader, and perhaps this is also inside the complexity of the system at the moment. Perhaps, who knows, maybe this guy just I found the guy that had my family murder, and let's do it. And it happens to be KGB, or, there can be also coincidences. So I'm not saying it was not an order by Khrushchev, but perhaps it also was inside the complexities of the system. So we have to finish these leaders. and whatever the president say, who cares? Or the general, how do you
The
say,
leader
general
of the
commission,
party, yes. I said the
the
general
leader of the
secretary. Well, just think of him as
general
the
say,
leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Yeah.
as we see nowadays, for example, the three-letter agencies in the United States just taking steps without much knowledge of the political parties. Um, so I think this is just an observation about that. So I don't think
Hmm.
Khrushchev was doing a lot of damage already. Not sure he would be willing to do something,
Hmm.
in balance to that. So that's one observation.
Well, it's
The
true. It's
second,
something that was set in motion before, obviously, like you're saying. If you think about it from that perspective, it's something that's been worked on since before he came to power. So yeah, from that perspective, it's it's it was, almost 15 years in the making.
yeah. So the second observation, and I jump one because I forgot what the question was exactly. But the second observation I had is that it's very interesting to pay attention to the facts that you mentioned. For example, that it was a short guy, a bald guy. You see the pictures. It was not a role model
The
of
ones
a
that haven't
beautiful.
been edited, if you see the pictures that haven't been edited, looks quite
Oh,
different.
it's
Which,
even
of course,
worse.
you could say about, yeah, I mean, you could say this about, real political leaders too. Obviously,
No, no, no.
in
Yeah,
today's day
yeah.
and age, everyone edits their photos to look better, but he looks significantly different in the non-edited historical photographs,
Mhm.
in contrast to the ones where he's being lionized as one of these heroes of modern day Ukraine. Yeah, so he definitely doesn't fit those parameters.
Yeah, but I think the point is that the guy has a kind of type of psychopathy or a full psychopathy, who can tell.
Hmm.
Uh, and this fits the profile of someone that the loser, the big L guy,
Hmm.
and which is extremely useful for the powers to control. You have
Except
some.
except only in the beginning because he starts doing what he wants to do.
Yeah,
And these
that's
powers realize, wait a second, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, as the famous quote goes, right? But he's going way, way, way farther than they would have anticipated him, both in the sense of the level of violence, the indiscriminate violence, but also stealing
Mhm.
money. I mean, it's almost like everything, right? He's he's on the one hand, he's this violent thug that has other people do his dirty work, but at the same time, and everyone is an enemy, right? Kind of almost paranoid there, or really paranoid. But at the same time, he is sort of benefiting financially, and so he has that type of foresight in terms of like, oh yeah, I better make some money. The fact that he's never worked in his life, even as before he became a political leader, you could say, well, political leaders don't necessarily have real jobs, but the fact that he really hasn't had any employment, sort of even for a month. I mean, other than working, perhaps helping his family in the fields as a child, as he was in between strangling all those cats, right? I mean, I think that says a lot as well. That there's a parasitic lifestyle that he was living off of the Nazi German funding. He was living off of, I'm assuming, right, other intelligence funding after World War II. He was living off of the actions of his underlings that were doing his dirty work. So it was obviously his family that was funding his college education. So someone was always stepping in to save him, right, and to give him money to do what he wanted. So there was really not a lot of accountability for his actions, right? And it was almost like he was saved miraculously. Initially, he had the death sentence for the
Mhm.
assassination of the Polish minister. It was commuted to life. He was supposed to be in prison for life. He was rescued in 1939 thanks to the Nazi German invasion. He was once again rescued in 1944. So there is this, eventually, of course, his luck ran out, but he went for 50 years of never having to work and doing whatever the hell he wanted. And it just happened to be that what he wanted to do was be very violent, very brutal towards his, real or perceived enemies, but also appropriating large sums of money to lead a nice lifestyle. So it's I don't know if this is a sign of his intelligence or warped intelligence, but definitely this level of the only thing that matters is what benefits me, and nothing else is really relevant.
Yeah, that's what the other point I was about to say. So people we give a lot of value to intelligence and capacity or going forward, all that. But you see that people that are considered winners, the guys that make millions, the guys that become high rank or on government and stuff like that. Those people have something that are not nice about them, like some level of psychopathy. I think every leader of a country, good or bad,
Well,
has
it's
to
not
have some
necessarily
level of
psychopathy, but it
psychopathy.
might be some kind of in some cases, almost like selective empathy and, kind of like stepping over people's heads to get to a certain level of, let's say, the corporate world, for instance, or the political world. So, yeah, there's definitely, it might not be like a full blown diagnosis on
Yeah,
the,
I don't mean that
on the,
each and every one of them are strangling cats on the youth. Okay,
sure.
but at some point they need to disconnect themselves from other human beings.
Hmm.
Even having hard decisions. Let's give a example of actual leaders. Having the decision to put to bring your country to war, even if it's to defend yourself.
Hmm.
That you're gonna
Well, or in the corporate
your
world,
decision is going to be
laying off
responsible.
thousands of people, right? In the corporate world, the decision to do that and not having the human connection or as much of empathy as kind of a more of a regular person would, who is not in that position. Yeah, I think it definitely matters. But obviously, though, in those cases, I think the level of brutality here is quite significant compared to
Sure.
the type of leaders we're describing. So
As you say, the mustache man look at the guy, say, "Whoa, whoa,
yeah, whoa, whoa,
calm
whoa, this is a
down,
little
dude."
too much. We got to take this one battalion. We got to put it in Belarus in the Soviet rear because they're a little crazy. They're trying to have their final showdown with the local Polish population. We don't want that. We want them somewhere else. They're a little crazy. So yeah, I mean, I think
Exactly.
that's just very, very telling that too much violence for the Nazis is a kind of a very telling sign. But my question
Plus,
was whether it was worth to assassinate this man
oh
who's
yeah, exactly,
been kind of
exactly.
lionized as he
So
was
yeah,
he was killed by the KGB.
I think this is an extremely important discussion that people should have more often,
Hmm.
because, as you say, this is a direct consequence from what happened was, canonizing the guy,
Hmm.
becoming a martyr, becoming a
Sure.
hero. We have in Brazil, I always try to bring things to Brazil. We have in Brazil, celebrated color revolutionaries
Hmm.
that are holidays in Brazil for these people,
Hmm.
and yeah, to a level it was a people's hero. We have Italy in Brazil. We have the hero of the
Mm.
two words.
Sure.
What's the name of the guy? Yeah, there's statues here everywhere. I used to
Hmm.
call him, the bully of two words because he went to Brazil just to make a mess. He went
Mm.
there, he made a mess, then he flew from Brazil. He was Italian, Garibaldi. He went to Brazil, he made a mess, then he ran away from Brazil with Anita, that became his wife, a Brazilian girl,
Hmm.
that he left to die here in Italy. She died from disease, being
Oh
pregnant
wow.
of his own
Mm.
child,
Mm.
and then he's celebrated here in Italy. But in Brazil, come on, dude, it was not a nice guy for us.
Father of
And
the modern Italian state, but not not of
it's,
Brazil. Yeah.
exactly, it's no, yeah, he's considered. And at some point, I think that people try to cover a little bit for him
Mhm.
because he is the father of modern Italy.
Mhm.
So yeah, he's responsible for that. Let's not dig too deep. We can go, but yeah, I think that the first consequence is that, yeah, you got martyrs, and not criminals. And
Yeah.
that's a
But I
very
think,
bad.
again, what you're describing, though, if there was a level of state building, yes, people overlook some, highly negative things about these individuals, but there's no state building in Banderas' case. There's just uh, indiscriminate
Just
violence. I mean, that's sort of one of the key differences, that there was
exactly.
no interest in, it seems to be like there's no interest. There was just taking out his perceived enemies. So there was no higher systemic thinking in terms of creating the state that he supposedly fantasized about while never actually having set foot in, in Ukraine, which is also kind of an ironic feature of
Funny.
this of this story. But yeah, I think this is sort of a more general question that is, up for the audience. You guys always have really interesting insights, not necessarily things that I would think of first. So please share in the comments, but also we can maybe do another episode where we can discuss that in more general terms, which is kind of difficult, but I mean, we can try to do that. So let us know if you want to hear that. But yeah, that's the end of the story today. It's the information, in addition to public records that are online, comes from the writings of Ales Buzina, who was a Ukrainian journalist, and he himself was assassinated in 2015 because he opposed the Maidan. So I really wanted to give credit to his sort of, I mean, I rephrased obviously what he had written, but some of this information comes from him, and I really wanted to credit someone who's now been, who he himself was assassinated in the aftermath of what was called the Revolution of Dignity. So sort of assassinating the best people who were trying to create environment where people got along, and amplifying those who went after everyone else, much like Bandera did in his time. I think was also very, very, very telling. But yeah, thank you for watching. Hope you like this occasional storytelling format. Of course, these are real events that we are describing, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Yeah, remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channels, and comment if you like, if you don't like. So see you next time. See you, Nina.
Thanks, guys.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.